The screen fades in from black, and we're immediately drawn into a warm, nostalgic scene. Margaret sits on a weathered wooden porch, her hands resting gently on her lap. She gazes out at a sprawling garden bathed in golden afternoon sunlight. The camera doesn't linger too long on her face, just enough to notice the faint lines etched by time, the softness of her eyes that seem to carry both joy and sorrow. A gentle breeze stirs the leaves of nearby trees and birds chirp softly. In the background, this is a place of peace, but there's an undercurrent of something deeper, a story waiting to be told. As the visuals unfold, a voiceover begins. It's Margaret's voice, calm yet tinged with emotion, as if she's recounting memories she hasn't revisited in years. 65 years, she says, pausing briefly as though letting the weight of those words settle. 65 years of marriage. People always said we were the perfect couple, the kind others looked up to. But perfection, well, it's often just an illusion. Her tone shifts slightly, becoming more reflective. John was my rock. He worked hard, loved deeply, and never complained. We built a life together, a good life, or so I thought. There's a pause here, deliberate and heavy, before she continues. But sometimes, even the strongest foundations can hide cracks, and when you finally see them, they change everything. Now the narrative dives deeper into their lives, painting a vivid picture of who John and Margaret were, not just as individuals, but as partners. The visuals shift to old photographs displayed on a mantelpiece. Each photo tells a story. A young John standing proudly beside his first handmade wooden chair, Margaret laughing as she holds a baby, wrapped snugly in a blanket, the two of them cutting a wedding cake together, surrounded by smiling friends and family. These images aren't just static. They come alive through subtle animations, zooming in or panning across to highlight details like the texture of John's carpentry, work, or the sparkle in Margaret's eyes. John, as Margaret describes him, was a man of quiet strength. Born in a small town in the Midwest, he grew up learning the value of hard work from his father, who ran a modest furniture shop. By the age of 18, John had already mastered the art of carpentry, crafting pieces so intricate they seemed almost magical. His hands, calloused and strong, could transform raw wood into objects of beauty. Yet, despite his skill, John remained humble, shying away from praise. He didn't talk much about himself, Margaret recalls. When people asked about his past, he'd smile and say, "That's all behind me now. At the time, I thought it was charming, his way of living in the present. Now I wonder what he was trying to leave behind." Margaret, on the other hand, was the heart of their home. Warm, nurturing, and endlessly patient, she dedicated herself to creating a sanctuary for her family. Her days were filled with cooking hearty meals, tending to their garden, and sewing clothes for their children. She took pride in these tasks, finding fulfillment in the simple joys of everyday life. "I wanted our home to be a place of love and safety," she explains, "a place where everyone felt welcome. And for 65 years, I believed I'd succeeded." Their relationship appeared idyllic, a testament to enduring love. They celebrated anniversaries with grand dinners, danced together at family gatherings, and supported one another through life's challenges. Friends and neighbors admired their bond, often remarking how rare it was to find such unwavering devotion in a world full of fleeting connections. Even during difficult times, like when their youngest son fell ill or when financial struggles threatened to overwhelm them, they faced adversity side by side, emerging stronger than ever. Yet, beneath this veneer of happiness, there were moments that hinted at something unresolved. Margaret remembers instances when John would withdraw into himself, retreating to his workshop late at night. She assumed it was stress or fatigue, dismissing any lingering doubts. Looking back, she admits, there were signs I chose to ignore. Small things, really, like how he avoided talking about his childhood or why he never kept in touch with old friends. I told myself it didn't matter, that what mattered was the life we'd built together. But maybe I should have asked more questions. At this point, the video cuts to a close-up shot of Margaret's hands, trembling slightly as she picks up one of the photographs. It's a black and white image of John, taken shortly after they met. He's wearing a suit that looks slightly too big for his frame, his hair neatly combed, and a shy smile playing on his lips. Margaret stares at the photo for a moment, then sets it down with care. Her expression is unreadable, a mix of nostalgia, sadness, and perhaps even regret. Before moving forward, let's take a brief moment to remind our viewers of the importance of uncovering truths, no matter how painful they may be. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more about Margaret's journey, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful narratives, like this one. Thank you for being here. With that, we return to Margaret's voice, now quieter, almost hesitant. For decades, I believed I knew everything about John, about us. But secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. And when they do, she trails off, leaving the sentence unfinished, inviting the audience to ponder what might come next. The scene opens with a slow pan across the interior of Margaret and John's home, a space once filled with warmth and laughter, now heavy with silence. Dust motes drift lazily in the sunlight streaming through half-drawn curtains. On the dining table sits a half-empty cup of tea, its surface rippled by the faint tremor of Margaret's hands as she sets it down. Her gaze lingers on the chair opposite hers, the one John used to occupy, and for a moment the room feels suffocatingly empty. Margaret's voice returns, quieter now, almost hesitant. It started subtly, really. At first I thought it was just age catching up with him. After all, John had always been so strong, so dependable. But then, things began to change. She pauses, her fingers tracing the edge of the teacup as though searching for something tangible to hold on to. Looking back, I realized those changes were signs, warnings I didn't understand until it was too late. The narrative delves deeper into John's final months, painting a vivid portrait of a man grappling with something far beyond the physical toll of illness. Visuals shift to scenes reimagined from memory. John, sitting alone in his workshop late at night, bathed in the dim glow of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. His tools lie scattered around him, untouched, as he stares blankly at a piece of wood he hasn't yet begun to carve. There's a tension in his posture, an unspoken burden weighing heavily on his shoulders. He stopped sleeping, Margaret continues, her voice trembling slightly. At first, he'd stay up reading or tinkering with his projects, but soon even that stopped. He'd sit by the window for hours staring out into the darkness. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find him pacing the hallway muttering to himself. When I asked what was wrong, he'd just shake his head and say, "Nothing, love. Go back to sleep." These moments of restlessness became more frequent, interspersed with flashes of anger that seemed entirely out of character. Once, during a family dinner, John snapped at their grandson for accidentally spilling a glass of water. The room fell silent, everyone exchanging uneasy glances as John abruptly stood up and left without explanation. Margaret recalls feeling bewildered, hurt, and increasingly worried. "That wasn't the John I knew," she says softly. "The man who raised our children, who joked with me over breakfast, who could fix anything with his hands. He was slipping away piece by piece." But it wasn't just his behavior that changed. It was also the secrets he began to keep. Margaret noticed small things at first, a locked drawer in his desk that had never been locked before, letters arriving in the mail addressed only to J.W. Instead of confronting him, she chose to ignore these anomalies, convincing herself they were insignificant. "I told myself it was stress," she admits, "or maybe the cancer taking its toll. I didn't want to believe there was anything more to it." Then came the letters. One evening, while tidying up the living room, Margaret stumbled upon a crumpled envelope tucked beneath a stack of newspapers. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it carefully, expecting to find nothing more than junk mail. What she discovered instead sent a chill down her spine. Pages filled with John's handwriting, sentences scrawled hastily in ink that smudged in places where his hand must have trembled. The words were cryptic, fragmented. Phrases like, "I can't keep running," and "she deserves to know the truth," leaping off the page. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she read them, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare ask aloud. "I put the letter back exactly where I found it," she confesses, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't bring myself to confront him, not then. Part of me hoped it was just ramblings brought on by illness. Another part, she hesitates, swallowing hard. Another part feared what I might learn if I dug deeper. As the weeks passed, John grew weaker, his body succumbing to the relentless advance of cancer. Yet, despite his frailty, he continued writing late into the night, often retreating to the attic where Margaret rarely ventured. She would hear the creak of the floorboards overhead, followed by the scratch of pen against paper, and wonder what drove him to pour his thoughts onto those pages. Occasionally, she considered following him, demanding answers, but fear held her back. Fear of what she might discover, fear of losing the man she thought she knew. And then, one day, everything shifted. It happened during a rare moment of clarity. John, lying in bed surrounded by pillows to ease his discomfort, reached out weakly for Margaret's hand. His grip was feeble, his skin pale and translucent, but his eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, were sharp and lucid. "When I'm gone," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "you'll understand everything. Just promise me you'll forgive me." Margaret froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Forgive you for what?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. But John simply closed his eyes, his breathing growing shallow once more. No matter how many times she pressed him after that, he refused to elaborate, leaving her with nothing but those haunting words echoing in her mind. The video cuts to a close-up of Margaret's face, tears glistening in her eyes as she recounts this memory. "That was the last real conversation we had," she says, her voice breaking. "A few days later, he slipped into a coma, and 2 weeks after that, he was gone." For a moment, the screen goes silent, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. Then, gently, Margaret adds, "Losing someone you love is hard enough. But losing them while knowing there are still unanswered questions, it's unbearable. It's like being trapped between worlds, unable to move forward or let go." Before transitioning to the next chapter, let's take another brief moment to connect with our audience. If you're finding this story compelling and want to support us in bringing more stories like this to life, please hit that subscribe button. Your engagement means the world to us and helps ensure we can continue sharing powerful narratives that resonate deeply. Thank you for joining Margaret on this journey. With that, we return to Margaret's voice, now steadier but tinged with determination. "After John passed, I promised myself I'd uncover the truth. Whatever it took, I needed to know what he had been hiding for 65 years, no less. Little did I know the answers would lead me down a path I could never have imagined." The audiobook screen fades to black for a brief moment before transitioning to a dimly lit attic, a space rarely visited, but now central to Margaret's quest for answers. Dust clings to the air, illuminated by shafts of light streaming through a cracked window. Boxes stacked haphazardly line the walls, their contents long forgotten. In the center of the room stands an old wooden desk, its surface scarred with scratches and stains from years of use. It's here that Margaret begins her search, her hands trembling as she lifts the lid of a dusty box labeled simply JW. Margaret's voice returns, softer now, almost hesitant, as though she's stepping into uncharted territory. "I didn't know what I was looking for," she admits. "A part of me hoped I wouldn't find anything, hoped that whatever John had been hiding wasn't real, but another part needed to know. For 65 years, I thought I knew him. Now I wasn't so sure." She starts with the smaller boxes, rifling through faded photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and trinkets from decades past. Each item feels like a piece of a puzzle, yet none seem to fit together. Then, tucked beneath a stack of old letters, she finds it, a bundle of papers bound tightly with twine, the edges worn and frayed from years of handling. Her breath catches in her throat as she unties the knot, revealing pages filled with John's familiar handwriting. The first letter is dated nearly 50 years ago, written during a time when Margaret assumed their lives were blissfully ordinary. As she reads the opening lines, her heart sinks. "My dearest Margaret," it begins, "if you're reading this, then I am gone, and the truth can no longer remain buried. Please forgive me for what I've done, for who I truly am." Margaret pauses, her eyes scanning the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Her mind races with questions. What could he possibly mean? Who was he, if not the man she had spent her life with? Slowly, reluctantly, she turns to the next page. What follows is a confession, a harrowing account of a crime committed in John's youth, a secret he carried with him for over 6 decades. According to the letters, John had once been involved in a robbery gone wrong. He and a group of friends, desperate and reckless, had targeted a local business owner known for keeping large sums of cash on hand. What started as a foolish plan quickly spiraled out of control when one of the men panicked, pulling a gun and accidentally shooting the owner. Though the wound wasn't fatal, the incident left the victim traumatized, and John terrified of being caught. I didn't pull the trigger, John wrote, his words desperate and raw. But I stood there frozen, unable to stop it. When the others fled, I stayed behind to help the man, calling for an ambulance and promising him I'd make things right. By the time the police arrived, I was already gone, fleeing town under cover of darkness. I changed my name, built a new life, and prayed every day that no one would ever connect me to that night. As Margaret reads further, the full weight of John's deception begins to sink in. Not only had he lied about his past, but he had also constructed an entirely new identity to escape the consequences of his actions. The name she had called him for 65 years, the name engraved on their wedding rings and etched into family photo albums, wasn't even his real name. It was a fabrication, a mask he wore to protect himself from the ghosts of his past. The revelation hits her like a tidal wave, leaving her breathless and disoriented. She lowers the letters, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and stares blankly at the wall. Tears stream down her face as she struggles to reconcile the man she loved with the stranger described in those pages. How could he do this? She whispers, her voice breaking. How could he live with this lie for so long? Yet, as she continues reading, another layer of complexity emerges. John's letters reveal not just guilt, but profound remorse. He writes about the sleepless nights, the constant fear of being discovered, and the overwhelming shame that shadowed every happy moment they shared. Every time I looked at you, Margaret, he confessed, I saw the goodness I wished I still possessed. You made me want to be better, to deserve the love you gave so freely, but the truth weighed on me, year after year, until it became unbearable. Margaret's emotions oscillate between anger, betrayal, and sorrow. She feels betrayed not just by the lies, but by the realization that the man she thought she knew was, in many ways, a stranger. Yet, amidst the pain, she begins to see glimpses of the man she loved, the man who sacrificed everything to protect her, even if it meant living a lie. He wasn't just running from the law, she reflects. He was running from himself, from the person he feared he might become if he stayed in that town, surrounded by reminders of what he'd done. To understand the full scope of John's past, Margaret decides to visit the place where it all began. Armed with the details from his letters, she travels to the small Midwestern town where he grew up, a place she had never visited during their marriage. The journey is both physically and emotionally exhausting, each mile bringing her closer to truths she isn't sure she's ready to face. When she arrives, the town feels eerily familiar, as though she's stepping into a chapter of John's life that existed parallel to her own. She visits the site of the robbery, now a vacant lot overrun with weeds, and speaks with a few elderly residents who remember the incident. One woman, whose father owned the business, recalls John staying behind to help the victim. He seemed genuinely sorry, she tells Margaret, not like the others who ran off without a second thought. These conversations paint a more nuanced picture of John, not as a villain, but as a flawed human being who made a terrible mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for it. Margaret begins to see that his secrecy wasn't just about protecting himself, it was also about shielding her from the pain of knowing the truth. Back home, Margaret sits at the kitchen table, surrounded by the letters and notes she's gathered. Her mind is a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, each thought colliding with the next. She thinks about the life they built together, the laughter, the struggles, the quiet moments of connection, and wonders how much of it was real. Was their love genuine, or merely a construct built on lies? It's strange, she muses aloud, her voice tinged with both sadness and resolve. Even now, knowing what I know, I can't hate him. How do you hate someone who gave you so much, even if it came at a cost? Maybe love isn't about perfection. Maybe it's about accepting the flaws, the secrets, the things we wish weren't true, because in the end, none of us are perfect. Before moving forward, let's take a moment to acknowledge the courage it takes to confront difficult truths. If you've been moved by Margaret's journey and want to support our channel in sharing stories that challenge and inspire, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us bring these narratives to life and ensures we can continue exploring the complexities of the human experience. Thank you for being here. With that, we return to Margaret's voice, now steadier, more determined. John's secret changed everything I thought I knew about him and about us. But it also taught me something important, that love isn't erased by mistakes, it's tested by them. And sometimes the hardest truths can lead to the deepest understanding. The screen fades to a soft, muted palette, a visual representation of the storm of emotion swirling within Margaret. She sits alone in the quiet sanctuary of her home, surrounded by remnants of the life she built with John. On the table before her are the letters, now neatly stacked, their edges worn from repeated handling. Her fingers trace the surface of the topmost page, as if trying to feel the weight of the words beneath her touch. For days, she has been consumed by these documents, reading and rereading them, searching for answers that seem just out of reach. Margaret's voice returns softer, now almost meditative, as though she's speaking directly to herself as much as to the audience. You spend your whole life thinking you know someone, she says, pausing to collect her thoughts. And then, in an instant, everything shifts. It's like looking at a painting you've admired for years, only to discover it's been hanging upside down. Suddenly, all the colors, all the shapes, they make sense in a way they never did before. Her reflection leads her to revisit moments from their marriage, re-examining them through the lens of John's confession. Scenes flash across the screen, John teaching their children how to ride bicycles, his hands steady on the handlebars. Margaret laughing as he spun her around during a rare night out, the two of them sitting side by side on the porch, watching the sunset. Each memory carries a dual meaning now, one rooted in the joy of the moment, the other shadowed by the knowledge of what lay hidden beneath. I used to think our love was untouchable, Margaret continues, her voice tinged with both nostalgia and sadness. But now I see it differently. Love isn't something static. It grows, changes, evolves. Sometimes it even breaks. And when it does, you have to decide whether to let it shatter completely or try to rebuild it. To better understand John's past, Margaret delves deeper into the history of the town where he grew up. She visits the local library, poring over old newspapers and records, piecing together fragments of the life he left behind. One article catches her attention, a grainy photograph of the business owner who was injured in the robbery, standing outside his shop with a bandaged arm. Beneath the image is a caption describing him as a kind man, beloved by the community. Margaret stares at the photo for a long time, imagining the fear and pain he must have felt that night, and the guilt John carried ever since. She also learns more about the group of friends involved in the crime. Through conversations with townsfolk and archived interviews, she discovers that John wasn't the ringleader. He was coerced into participating by older, more reckless individuals. When the situation escalated, he tried to intervene, staying behind to help the victim while the others fled. This detail resonates deeply with Margaret, offering a glimmer of redemption amidst the darkness. He didn't choose that path willingly, she realizes. He was pushed onto it, and once he stepped off, he spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. As Margaret pieces together these fragments, she begins to see John not just as the man who deceived her, but as someone who bore the burden of his mistakes every day. His secrecy wasn't just about protecting himself, it was about shielding her from the pain of knowing the truth. He wanted me to believe in him, she reflects, not the person he used to be, but the person he became because of me. This realization sparks a shift in Margaret's perspective. While the betrayal still stings, she starts to view their relationship through a broader lens, one that acknowledges imperfection without dismissing its value. She thinks about the sacrifices John made, not just for her, but for their family. He worked tirelessly to provide for them, poured his heart into crafting furniture that would last generations, and created a home filled with warmth and stability. These acts weren't diminished by his past. Rather, they were shaped by it. The narrative transitions to a poignant scene, Margaret visiting the cemetery where John is buried. The camera lingers on her face as she kneels beside his grave, placing a single flower atop the headstone. Her lips move silently, forming words only she can hear. The wind rustles through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and grass. For the first time since discovering the letters, Margaret feels a sense of peace, not absolution, but acceptance. "I don't think forgiveness is something you give to someone else," she says, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's something you give to yourself. By holding on to anger, I was letting John's secret define me, but I refuse to let it anymore. Our love wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that's enough." Back at home, Margaret begins writing her own letters, not to John, but to their children and grandchildren. She wants them to know the truth, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the complexity of human relationships. "No one is perfect," she writes. "We all carry secrets, regrets, things we wish we could undo. But love has a way of transcending those flaws if we let it." The video cuts to a close-up of Margaret's handwriting, the ink flowing smoothly across the page. Her words are heartfelt and raw, capturing the essence of her journey. She talks about the importance of honesty, the courage it takes to confront difficult truths, and the resilience required to rebuild trust. These letters become her legacy, a way of ensuring that John's story and hers is remembered not just for its mistakes, but for its lessons. Before concluding the chapter, let's take another moment to connect with our audience. If Margaret's journey has resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Stories like this remind us of the power of vulnerability and the strength it takes to face the unknown. Your support allows us to continue sharing narratives that inspire empathy, reflection, and growth. Thank you for joining us on this emotional voyage. With that, we return to Margaret's voice, now imbued with a quiet strength. "John's secret changed me in ways I never expected. It forced me to confront parts of myself I'd rather ignore, the need for control, the fear of uncertainty. But it also taught me that love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to stay, even when the road gets rough, even when the truth hurts." The screen transitions abruptly, mirroring the sudden shift in Margaret's understanding. The soft, contemplative atmosphere of the previous chapter gives way to something sharper, more urgent. The camera zooms in on Margaret's face as she sits at her kitchen table, her hands trembling around a newly discovered document, a faded newspaper clipping tucked inside one of John's letters. Her eyes widen, darting across the text as realization dawns. The room seems to shrink around her, the air thick with the weight of what she's about to uncover. Margaret's voice returns, strained and barely audible, as though she's speaking through a storm of conflicting emotions. "I thought I understood," she whispers, her voice cracking under the strain. "I thought I knew the worst of it. But this changes everything." What she holds in her hands isn't just another piece of John's confession. It's a bombshell that rewrites the narrative entirely. The article details not only the robbery but also the aftermath, how the victim, despite surviving the shooting, died months later from complications related to his injuries. What John had described as a non-fatal incident was, in fact, indirectly responsible for the man's death. Worse still, the article reveals that John wasn't merely an accomplice. He was identified by witnesses as the one who pulled the trigger, albeit accidentally, during the chaos of the crime. Margaret's mind races as she processes this information. She flips back through the letters, searching for any mention of this detail, but finds none. It's clear now that John omitted this crucial part of the story, perhaps unable to confront it himself. "He lied to me again," she says, her voice rising with anger and disbelief. Even in his confession, he couldn't tell me the whole truth. The visuals shift to a montage of Margaret's internal turmoil, her pacing the length of the living room, clutching the article tightly, sitting on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the wall, standing in front of the mirror, her reflection, blurred by tears. Each scene captures the raw intensity of her emotions, rage, grief, betrayal, all colliding in a maelstrom she can barely contain. But then, amidst the chaos, another revelation emerges, one that forces Margaret to reconsider everything once more. Buried within the same box of letters is a second, smaller envelope addressed to her. Unlike the others, this one bears her name in John's shaky handwriting. Her heart pounds as she opens it, unfolding a single sheet of paper covered in his familiar scrawl. "Margaret," the letter begins, "if you're reading this, then I've failed to protect you from the hardest truth of all. Yes, I pulled the trigger that night. Yes, the man died because of my actions. But there's something else you need to know, something I couldn't bring myself to write until now." The camera lingers on Margaret's face as she reads, her expression shifting from shock to confusion to something akin to awe. John goes on to explain that while he was indeed responsible for the shooting, he acted out of desperation to save someone else, a young woman who had been taken hostage during the robbery. When one of the other men threatened her life, John intervened, attempting to disarm him. In the struggle, the gun discharged, striking both the victim and the hostage. Though the hostage survived, the victim succumbed to his injuries months later. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," John writes. "All I wanted was to protect her, to make sure she got home safely. That's why I stayed behind to help him, even though I knew it meant risking my freedom. And when I left town, I vowed never to let anyone else suffer because of me." As Margaret absorbs this new information, the pieces of the puzzle finally fall into place. John wasn't just a criminal fleeing justice, he was a man caught in an impossible situation, forced to choose between two lives. His decision to run wasn't born purely of self-preservation, it was an act of sacrifice, a desperate attempt to shield others from further harm. The video cuts to a series of flashbacks, reconstructed based on John's descriptions. We see a younger John, wide-eyed and terrified, stepping between the hostage and her captor. We hear the deafening crack of the gunshot, followed by screams. And we watch as John kneels beside the wounded victim, pressing a makeshift bandage to his wound and pleading with him to hold on. These scenes are visceral and haunting, capturing the moral ambiguity of the moment, the kind of split-second decision that defines a lifetime. Margaret's voice breaks through the silence, trembling but resolute. "For so long I thought I was the one who saved him, that I gave him a second chance at life. But now I realize he saved someone too. Maybe that's why he chose me. Maybe he saw in me the same hope he clung to after that night, the belief that people can change, that redemption is possible." This epiphany brings Margaret to a crossroads. She must decide what to do with the truth she's uncovered. Does she expose John's past, ensuring that history remembers him not as a loving husband but as a man who took a life? Or does she honor his memory by keeping his secret, allowing their shared life to stand as a testament to the power of forgiveness and transformation? Her decision comes slowly, born not of impulse but of deep reflection. Sitting at the kitchen table once more, she gathers the letters and places them carefully into a wooden box, the same one she found in the attic. As she closes the lid, her hand steady for the first time in weeks, she speaks directly to the eye. "Camera," her voice filled with quiet conviction, "John made mistakes, terrible ones, but he also spent 65 years trying to be better. He built a life rooted in love, kindness, and service. Isn't that worth remembering? Isn't that what matters most?" Before moving forward, let's take a moment to acknowledge the courage it takes to grapple with such complex truths. If Margaret's story has resonated with you, if it's challenged you to think differently about love, forgiveness, or the nature of humanity, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing stories like this to life, stories that remind us of the beauty and complexity of the human experience. Thank you for being here. With that, we return to Margaret's voice, now calm and unwavering. The past doesn't define us, it shapes us. And sometimes the hardest truths lead to the deepest understanding. The screen softens, bathed in warm, golden light, a stark contrast to the tension of the climax. Margaret stands on the porch once more, this time at sunrise. The world around her is quiet, serene, as though holding its breath. She holds the wooden box containing John's letters close to her chest, her fingers tracing its edges gently, almost reverently. For the first time in months, there's a sense of peace in her posture, a quiet acceptance that radiates from within. Margaret's voice returns, steady and resolute, carrying the weight of everything she's endured. When I started this journey, she begins, her gaze fixed on the horizon, I thought I was searching for answers, but what I found instead was something far greater, clarity, not just about John, but about myself, about us. She pauses, taking a deep breath as though gathering her thoughts. Love isn't perfect. It never has been, and it never will be. It's messy, complicated, full of contradictions, but that doesn't make it any less real. If anything, it makes it stronger. Because true love isn't about ignoring flaws, it's about embracing them. It's about choosing to stay, even when the truth hurts. The visuals shift to scenes of Margaret's daily life, now infused with a renewed sense of purpose. She tends to her garden, planting new flowers alongside the old ones. She writes letters to her grandchildren, sharing not just John's story, but her own reflections on life, love, and resilience. She visits the cemetery regularly, leaving fresh flowers at John's grave and speaking to him as though he's still listening. These moments are simple yet profound, capturing the essence of healing and growth. I won't pretend it's been easy, Margaret admits, her voice tinged with both sadness and gratitude. There are days when the pain feels unbearable, when I wonder if I'll ever truly move on. But then I remember the life we built together, the laughter, the struggles, the quiet moments that made it all worthwhile. And I realize I wouldn't trade those memories for anything, not even the truth. Her decision to keep John's secret becomes an act of grace, a way of honoring the man he became rather than the mistakes he made. By choosing forgiveness over judgment, she transforms their story from one of betrayal into one of redemption. We're all flawed, she says, her words resonating with quiet wisdom. Every single one of us carries scars, secrets, things we wish we could undo. But that doesn't mean we're unworthy of love. It means we're human. The narrative transitions to a poignant final scene. Margaret sitting by the fireplace, the wooden box resting on her lap. She opens it one last time, running her fingers over the letters inside. Then, with a small, bittersweet smile, she closes it and places it on the mantelpiece beside a framed photograph of her and John on their wedding day. Their younger selves beam back at her, frozen in a moment of pure joy. I don't know what comes next, Margaret confesses, her voice soft but filled with determination. But I do know this. I'm ready to face it. Whatever the future holds, I'll carry John's memory with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what it means to love deeply, imperfectly, and unconditionally. As the camera pulls back, the room fades into darkness, leaving only the faint glow of the fire illuminating Margaret's face. Her final words linger in the air, spoken with a quiet strength that echoes long after the screen goes black. In the end, it's not our mistakes that define us. It's how we choose to move forward, and I choose love. Before the video ends, let's take one final moment to connect with our audience. If Margaret's story has touched your heart, if it's inspired you to reflect on your own relationships, challenges, or capacity for forgiveness, please consider subscribing to our channel. Stories like this remind us of the beauty and complexity of the human experience, and your support allows us to continue sharing narratives that challenge, inspire, and uplift. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. The screen fades to black, and text appears, dedicated to the power of love, forgiveness, and the courage to seek the truth. A soft piano melody plays as the credits roll, leaving the audience with a lingering sense of hope and introspection.